So added a couple things here on the left today. You should still have access to your labs. We talked about that, and access to the NDG labs. You will not necessarily need to do this get pull stuff today because the labs that we're doing will not necessarily be a part of that package. I am working after the session today. I will work on a different version of this lab environment that's here. So we talked a little bit about this on the GitHub. I'll actually get this better in the links there too, so you have a direct access to it. But this is intended to be the labs. If you come up here and do a dash simple, and I'll link this one as well. This one will be intended to be a self-contained Docker container, so you don't have to have a bunch of extra pieces to it. It's just a single download and it'll pull down. I will also intend on hosting that. So just like the URL for this, you have WWC2025. If you put in a dash labs up here, so it looks something like that. It won't do anything right now, but that will end up pointing to that lab environment that will automatically stay up and running all the time. So it won't fire up containers. It'll just have all those modules running to where you can start them at any point in time. I just wasn't able to get that completed last night trying to work on this other stuff. All right. Let's see here. What else is out there? Obviously, our day 3 materials out there. Everybody kind of requested a little bit of resources. So under the resources, you should have, and it looks like it already updated, the link for the YouTube playlist. So you can open that up, and then the content from the last couple of days is out there. The URLs, these are kind of links to all those different topics or software or something that we talked about yesterday. I've tried to go in there and make a big list for that.
Did you put the one that we talked about last night?
Well, do you remember the context of which one we were talking about?
I think it was it NGD, the one that had the educators? I know you did EC Council and the
Oh,
other one.
the NDG stuff. Yeah, I could put that in there as well. Let's see here.
Yeah, I went ahead and registered for that since you were talking about it. And then once I was approved, there's a lot of courses there. I didn't know they had that much stuff.
Oh yeah, there's lots and lots of content and courses there. So let's see, we could do something like that. Okay. That one would be there. Let's see here. I'll put the GitHub stuff up here at the top too. Thinking about it. So this one would be for the website. That added in. Apologize for this morning, but I want to make sure any links or anything else doesn't get forgotten by the end of the day, because that tends to happen as we get to moving through everything. Let's see. Like I said, this one will change out for that simple side so that it's easier for you guys to use it in the classroom than having to deploy it all. But it would operate the exact same as what we did in class. All right, get those out there. So we talked about the AI software that we looked at, which was anything LLM or even using Olama. Hey, Fernando, no problem. Let me make sure I get you marked off here. There we go. Perfect. We also talked about traffic generation tools. T-Rex was a big one for that one from Cisco. All the network monitoring tools, whether it was Grafana or Prometheus, Cacti, RRD tool, that kind of stuff. Nagios that's in there. Those can all be deployed on Docker containers for the most part, as long as they have access to the network that you want to get them deployed on. We talked about some IDS, IPS tools like Zeek and Suricata, and then full SOC solutions that would have something like the full SIME, and those would be something with Security Onion. Wazaa was another one we considered going through. That's the one I used in the classroom. Some other cyber tools and testing, we'll get into more of these today, which is CTFD and being able to deploy a capture the flag event. Cyber Chef is one that's great for students that need to be able to have access to tools for decoding hashing or other CTFs if you're looking to get your clubs and stuff involved in challenges or competitions. Cyber Chef is a great resource for them to have practice with. And then some links down below for Docker Desktop, Proxmox itself. And then there's a couple links there for Guacamole. And so for those of you that don't have a NetLab type system and will need to build something in the classroom, but give people remote access, and potentially you would rather do that with VNC versus giving them direct access to the Proxmox server, using something like Guacamole in front of it would be a great way to do that. And essentially what it does is it would connect to VNC on the inside and then acts as a proxy out to the internet. So a user can have a couple saved links inside of there. If you look at this setup one is a YouTube video that I kind of watched through this morning that pretty much sets it up exactly the way I would expect. Instead of setting it up as a Docker container, it runs it on Proxmox VE, but you could do the same type of configuration if you wanted to run it raw on Proxmox. Or I'm sorry, on Docker. But once you get these configurations and stuff set up, you would get something like here. Let me go back a little bit. So we would have this kind of login on this page, and then you could create new connections. And so you would create a new connection for every virtual machine that you wanted that student to have access to on the inside. You could do it to where they have access to all of them, or you could limit each student to a set of this. So obviously, this is a little more administrative heavy than something like a NetLab system, but it is a great tool for you to give remote access to your students on that. It's also better than having to hand out VPN accounts and then having them come in and then access the Proxmox directly, in which case you'd have to do a bunch of permissions there. I don't know how else to put it other than it can be a poor man's version of what you would see with the NDG NetLab product. Now, there's still going to be some features that you want to be able to do, like have it automatically fire these virtual machines up or tear them down or reset them, that kind of stuff. Those features wouldn't be baked in. So you would end up running all these virtual machines or even containers all at once, and you would just have to give them VNC access on that. So it's not a cure-all, but it's definitely a great resource for a small lab with limited resources. It's a great way for that to work out.
Sounds like me.
And then there's some couple walkthroughs here, the official one on how to deploy Guacamole in Docker. And so I think we talked a little bit about doing some Docker basics today, and we can certainly do that on how to deploy images that you find out there and how to get them up and running. All right, no problem, Jack. I think I got you marked off here. If not, I'll get you. Oh, there we go. Okay. So again, that's all under resources over here on the left-hand side. You should have those URL resources. And then, of course, those GitHub ones just showed up here at the top. And that way, if you want to clone any of those resources that we've used in this workshop, you're happy to do so. Welcome to do so. All right. As far as housekeeping, did anybody have anything else that I had on my list that I promised everybody? I was trying to go through all my notes yesterday. I know we talked about building out some virtual environments today, even doing something like a container that would do some home traffic. We should have this resource list of everything in there and some network traffic tools And those are the list from yesterday. So I think I got everything. Oh, and an OVA. I'll work on getting that done and explain what's going on there. And that was just an OVA of the NetLab VM that already had Docker Desktop installed. I can definitely package that up in a way if we need to. And then as far as our list today, these were kind of the topics that we were looking at. We had designated for sure that we wanted some kind of lab here. And I think we resolved that this was going to be our hands-on activity of building out a capture the flag in the form of a Jeopardy style. And so I'll show you guys how to deploy a CTFD instance, and then we can kind of work together to create some questions that we'll end up putting in there. And you guys would have a CTF at the end of this that we could export and share out with everybody. And then from the forensic side, instead of building a new app for that, what I decided to do was give you guys access to the digital forensics lab set that's available from NDG. And that's available on our lab system. So if you come out here for the NetLab access and you guys log in today, you'll notice there'll be a little bit of a change when you log in. So if you go to the labs, and you go to make a reservation today. Of course, you won't see this screen because there's just a 1 in there. But when you do click on that, you'll see access to 4 different pieces of content. So this would be our lab environment that has that Docker container, and you guys are welcome to keep using that. But I did offer up the NDG Forensics lab set, so you guys have access to these 21 labs dealing with digital forensics. The main one that I kind of wanted to point out is I think you guys were looking at dealing with autopsy and doing live forensics or even creating a forensic image. We also could make it to where you guys just pick one and do that. And that's actually one of my favorites, is just letting anybody pick which one they want to do, complete the lab, and then kind of give feedback to everybody as to what they thought about that one. And then the same way with the ethical hacking series. So series 1 is all based off Linux VMs. And it has some really good topics in here where this is what I would typically use like to my undergrad or graduate level, but the concepts are well written in a way that you could easily use them at the high school level. But one of the main labs in here was that ARP spoofing and man-in-the-middle attack. That was one that we had talked about the other day. And so that was kind of what I held reserved for that one. But you're welcome to play around with those labs. If you need access to those beyond, January, you can always go out and get those from those instructor resources from NDG. They're happy to give you pods on their online system for that purpose. All right. And then I think we were really going to wrap up after the assessment today is really just kind of talking about how we can integrate this into the classroom. So I plan on that being kind of an open-ended half after we get done with assessment, is kind of mostly going back to that workshop, kind of like the end of yesterday. I really like that, where people could share how they're using stuff and how they would like to implement this. And then if there's anything I need to help build or something like that at the end. I would also cover, I think you guys were wanting to kind of run through my undergrad, grad programs, classes taught, tools taught in there. I can certainly do that at that time. Does that look like what we were looking to cover today? Anything I missed?
Looks great.
Okay.
Love to give you a thumbs up, but I simply can't find it.
Well, if you had a haptic mouse, you could click on the button and come down here and give a thumbs up. So. All right. Let's see here. So day 3, we'll cover a couple of these topics in here. I think I got everybody on the list here. 16. That would be 15 minus me. Yep, that looks good. All right, so today's really going to be about teaching, labs, implementation. We'll talk a little bit about the offensive side and some recon and how to do vulnerabilities. So this one's going to be a little more tool heavy today and less about concept, but still conceptual for the beginners that are trying to get started in there. So offensive security for beginners, this is our ethical framing. The idea behind this is how to teach good offensive security without releasing a bunch of tools that students can go and cause some real troubles for themselves if they don't have a nice environment to learn things on. So some of the offensive techniques that will help these defenders, because again, we're trying to teach them the blue team side, but realistically, they need to know a little bit about red team in order to do that defense. So, understanding how that attacker's thinking and what's the things that they're going to do, what kind of procedures, steps do they follow, identify those weak points that you may have in your network, prioritize what you should be defending first, and then responding more effectively when those type of attacks are coming in. And from my side, even being on industry on the like Palo Altos is a great example. Those are a huge target anymore with the Global Protect VPN stuff. And we just see constant brute force attacks in that regard. And they're not sitting there hammering it with like 30 logins in a second. It's more that they trickle it in over time so that they don't capture any filters or hit anything like fail to ban. If anybody's familiar with the fail to ban product, essentially if they fail 5 login attempts within an hour, it bans them on the system. A lot of routers and devices have that kind of software built in, but it is a software package that you can use as well. It's great to run on your SSH Linux boxes. So if you have internet available to SSH into a box, one, you should be using certs and keys for that as opposed to username and passwords. And then two, using something like fail to ban under the hood so that if somebody's sitting there trying to brute force in, it just ends up banning that IP address. The real problem with just banning the IP address is most of these attackers are utilizing some of those topics we talked about yesterday, like cloud. So they're spinning up random Amazon containers and they can start attacking you from it. And then once that one IP address is compromised, they shut it down, spin it up, and they get a new IP address. So there's some issues with that. Obviously, Amazon doesn't want that as well because their IP addresses start getting listed on people's blacklists. So they tend to take their own initiative to try to help stop that as much as possible. That offensive security side should have some pretty strong foundations in understanding authorization, define scope and the rules of engagement as to what they're doing. This is particularly important if you are doing this as a pen test for a company. You definitely want to get those scopes defined and what you have authorization to do and not to do. And that's all written out in typically a rules of engagement document. And you want to have clear learning objectives when we're teaching that. So we never really want students to do any kind of targeting on real systems without permission. I would say regardless of permission or not, we definitely don't want them targeting real systems in the network. Specifically, unless you have a sandbox lab environment, then, obviously that makes sense. But I wouldn't have them go poke around on the campus network and see what they can find. Most IT staff are not very forgiving in that regard. Regardless what you're training, right? So I can remember in my undergrad, we had learned a new tool and we actually accidentally plugged into the wrong jack. Our labs were wired in a way that we would have one or actually 3 network jacks that were the internal lab for just different networks in the lab. And then we had one outside jack. And we were learning this new tool and we had it plugged in the wrong one. And eventually without realizing it, we had dumped the entire password database for the university. It wasn't a very secure database back then. It was kind of an LDAP, and we were able to get in pretty easily and dump every username and password for all the staff and the students and everything in between. There again, because that was the old NTLM type storage, it was very easy to crack those passwords because we had the hash. All we had to do was look up the hash in the table and get the password. Thankfully, our IT staff wasn't as upset as they were. They also realized they had a pretty big vulnerability, and we went to them right away, with what we did, because it wasn't intentional. We actually had an LDAP server on our lab network that we were using this to test in and learn on. We just had the laptop plugged into the wrong port. Needless to say, that kind of thing got fixed over time, but it was a real learning lesson for both students and for the instructors. Try not to ever collect real credentials like what I just talked about. Never try things out on the live networks, and really don't try to imitate any real scams or brands and recreate those. It's just opening a door for that one student that will reach out and test, so to speak, on something, and they're going to end up in trouble. I've had several over the years that have done that knowingly and willingly were testing some of those tools out on campus networks, and the campus was obviously recording everything that was going on, and it was pretty easy for them to get kicked out of the system and out of the university. The other problem with that is it isn't just a university or a state university. As I know, some of you are state institutions. That's literally hacking into state property, right? So there's a strong chance if they wanted to, they could be prosecuted even further. Some safe teaching approaches is really to look at log analysis. That's a fairly benign way of going through and not really revealing a ton of information. Having some controlled simulation. Now, I'm not a big fan on the simulation side of the house. That's one thing material-wise, resource-wise, that I never felt good about simulations. And I get why they're there, because there's no chance of anything going wrong. It's just a simulation. But a lot of times it's extremely hard to rebuild a live environment in the form of a simulation that the student doesn't understand what could go wrong. In other words, you build a lot of guardrails to have a simulation where if they type the wrong command in Linux and it wipes the system, they need to learn that, and they have to learn how to recover from that. So I really like the idea of live exercises, but in a sandbox environment and in that approved lab environment. I think what we saw yesterday was one of the biggest things to get students to understand what's going on is kind of focusing in on some reasoning exercises, whether that's setting up scenarios and getting feedback from them, and then having them actually execute as an example of that in the lab environment. I kind of jotted this down here, is that we really want to study how attacks work so we can stop them, right? We're not doing it to be the bad guys. We're trying to do this to be the good guys. All right. So to start that process for offensive security, it always begins within the reconnaissance stage. And so with reconnaissance, we are looking to identify, we'll enumerate different systems, look for exploits, and then once we get an exploit and that vulnerability passed, we want to escalate that and see how high we can get in our privilege. We always want to set up persistence, meaning we want to set up that backdoor or that rootkit so that if the customer determines something's going on in their system, they patch the vulnerability. It doesn't really matter because we're already rootkitted in, and we can have that machine call back to us at any point in time. You will be amazed, and I think somebody mentioned that the other day with some of these old routers and stuff that are, phoning home to Taiwan and stuff. And essentially, that kind of thing is a rootkit. Whether you like it or not, it's essentially a rootkit. In the early days of IoT, you would find that embedded into your light bulbs, your Wi-Fi switches that you may have, and I'm talking about like light switches or your Christmas light switches that are turned off and on by Wi-Fi. All of those were notorious for having rootkits that were sending data and information back to wherever they were from, whichever country it may have been. So being able to see that kind of traffic on the network and just null route it means that you can still use those products. You're just not contributing all your data and information being exfiltrated out. And that kind of comes to exfiltration, is most attackers are then trying to figure out how they're going to extract that data. So whether they simply upload it to an FTP, which is pretty shaky, right? I mean, if you're going to take traffic off my network, I see it as an FTP going to an IP address. It's pretty easy to point the finger as to what's going. So they'll tend to use sneakier techniques, in which case they'll bundle up your data, chop it into blocks, and then those blocks will end up getting sent out in random ways, whether it's through DNS requests. It could be done through regular HTTP requests. And the way that works is you do a request to an HTTP with a block of data, and most of that data could be just simply base 64 encoded. So we talked about that with CyberChef and just how easy Base64 is to work with. So you could take a chunk of data, even a file, break it into chunks of Base64 encoding, and then when you submit it, it looks like garbage, right? It's just a bunch of numbers and letters. But if you take all of that and reassemble it back in the right order on the far side, you essentially exfiltrated that entire file. And therefore, you can put that data back together and see whatever was in there, whether it was a Word document, Excel sheet, pictures, all the way up to much larger files. So mapping that back to our CIA triad, each step is going to impact the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability. So for example, our credential theft, if they are dropping our passwords, which is a great point there. So most of you said you're at least somewhat familiar with Linux, you're familiar with Windows. What file are we looking for in Linux systems in order to grab the credentials? Does anybody know that one? Besides probably Fernando and Kirk, because I think you guys were listed as ones that worked with that kind of stuff. All right, Fernando, Kirk, any of those guys? Kind of answer we got there.
I don't know if it's the shadow or the password file. I don't
Yeah,
know.
your shadow file is the main one, right? If you can compromise the shadow file, you got the keys to the kingdom. But you are right. In the passwords file, it is at least encoded there, right? It's hashed anyway, so it's much better if we can get the actual shadow one where it's not necessarily raw text, but it's not necessarily salted in some cases either. Does anybody know what that is called in the Windows side of the house? Yeah, the SAM, right? And so that SAM is generally hard to get unless you're a local administrator. There's some pretty easy tools where you can use that to dump that SAM table. It's better or easier per se if you have physical access to the system or if it's a virtual system, is being able to reboot that with like a live ISO. There's several of them out there, and it's a great way for you to dump the password list, reboot the machine, and then put it back. So, for example, if I gained physical access to, say, an instructor office, their laptop or desktop is sitting in there, I simply reboot it to a jump drive, and that jump drive happens to have that live ISO. I can dump the password table, then reboot the system, put them right back where they were. And short of it looking like, oh, Windows Update did an update again and rebooted my system overnight, they would never know that I stole all the password tables off there. Now, I'd still have to break the hashes, but once I have that hash table, I can do that at my own time. And hopefully I can figure out those passwords before the 30-day, 60-day, 90-day required password change of whatever policy that institution has. So as they always say, if you can get physical access to a machine, you pretty much have keys to the kingdom in that regard. The beauty is you didn't necessarily change the password there, right? You just dumped the table and kind of moved on. There's also things like I talked about earlier where we don't necessarily even need to crack the password. There's an opportunity based on some configurations where we could just pass the hash in, and that process allows us to log in without ever knowing what that was. On the data modification and integrity, obviously we want to, in terms of an attack, where would we see that the most? Data modification done by an attacker that would lower the integrity of something. I kind of talked about it a little bit yesterday. If I was an attacker breaking in, what kind of files might I want to change during my attack? Possibly accounts. We wouldn't necessarily want to do that too quickly because that would raise a flag. Tim, you're in the right direction. Is logs, right? Kirk, you nailed it. So being able to go in and modify logs to make it look like we never got in the system, clean and wipe any trace of what we've done on the system, so that when they go back and look, because that's what most IT people do, is go check the logs. Well, if there's nothing in the logs, and that's because they've been compromised, the attacker cleaned them all or wiped them all on their way out. A lot of times they're looking to modify them and not wipe them. That way you never see anything in there. If you wipe them, it's a clear indication that somebody was in the network, and they may take extensive more action. They may go do rootkit scanners and some other stuff. But if you never really see an entry in there, and then they don't know how to call it good or bad, that would be a problem. And so to alleviate that, does anybody remember what we talked about yesterday on a blue team, where we can make sure that even if they change the account logs on that system, we would still have a solution? Yeah, it's kind of dumping the log off to a separate system. In this case, it would be our SIME or our log collector, right? And the idea is that it has a copy, and it can become your source of truth, so that even if an attacker compromises the in-system logs, they can't compromise the log system as a whole, or the syslog server or the SIME, unless they were able to get that deep into the network. So doing segregation, like what Fernando was talking about there in the chat, network segregation is a great way to go about segregating and separating where these things could happen. In other words, you wouldn't want to run your Waza server and your log server on the same network, or have the same network firewall rules that all the clients are on, right? That's why we usually have most of you guys are teaching network segmentation. What do we usually put those kind of systems on? There's a particular acronym for it, or a name for that network that we would host our services on. Anybody know what that is? Think military. More military there, Fernando. There you go, DMZ. So we would typically have a DMZ network, which means we typically allow internet access from the outside into it, or maybe we just allow access from our management network to the DMZ, or even from our users network to the DMZ. Those may all have very separate rules in the firewall, and that's typically where you host your services. So that's where you put your web servers. That's where you would put maybe your access servers, things like that, that would be outward facing. Now, if those are accessing database servers, you probably wouldn't put those out there on the DMZ. You would want those on an internal network, because only those services should be able to reach out to that, and not the outside being able to reach into those database type servers. So lots of different network design that can help build layers. If you remember from yesterday, we build those layers of security in, so that even if they were to able to get into the DMZ zone, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're all the way into our database zone or some of our other secure network stuff. And then we talked about ransomware in terms of availability. Ransomware would be one key aspect. What's the bigger one that everybody sees today? Instead of a ransomware attack, what other kind of attack do we see? And we saw a lot of this here within the last month with Cloudflare and Amazon and a few others. Yeah, a DDoS attack, right? So you have your standard DOS attack, or your denial of service attack. And then you would have the DDoS attack, which is your distributed attack. So if it's a standard denial of service attack, it's usually one IP address that's sending a flood of pings, or sending a bunch of ICMP packets or TCP packets, or sending a bunch of requests. And the idea behind it is that you're flooding whatever XYZ service is with so many requests, and because that system is set up to respond to those requests, it's spiking the CPU utilization or other items, or saturating the network so bad that it can't respond anymore. The difference between that and a distributed one is that a distributed one is typically using a botnet or some collection of other machines. It doesn't even have to be machines. It could be light bulbs across the US. Anything with an IP address that they can put some attacking software on to be able to come back and attack you. And the harder part with that is it's not one IP address. So we can't, as administrators, just jump in the firewall and start blocking IPs, because those IPs are going to be coming from thousands or hundreds of thousands of places in order to orchestrate that attack. Typically, if you find yourself victim to those, they're usually using a very large botnet. And so when you see it in the news that they start talking about botnets were uncovered or a large botnet, that's when you tend to get a little nervous as a bigger target, because the more the bots that are in that network, the more distributed they could be across in their attack. There was a local high school around here that fell victim to this. Unfortunately, it was being conducted by the student. So the student was actually on the network and had paid for a botnet, and then was able to constantly update their IP address on the inside, so that even though when they started shutting down all the traffic coming in, it didn't matter. They could still re-register with new IPs. So for example, the school, had an IP address, and that's what they publicly hosted their LMS on. That's what the whole point of the attack was to take down the LMS so that they didn't have to take the exam that day. Yeah, it's a pretty common thing that happens, and it happens at schools. It happens at county offices, city offices, that kind of stuff. It's pretty easy to accomplish. The worst part about this one is it wasn't just a normal attack. They ended up filling more than a 10 gig pipe in this case, and the reason for that was because there was a misconfiguration, like we talked about yesterday, and that misconfiguration allowed a certain type of traffic that doesn't really exist. And because of that, it didn't know how to respond. And so it ended up saturating not just the school, but the actual ISP. And because it saturated the ISP, it took down all the customers as well. So it's pretty interesting attack that happened there. Gotcha, Harry. Let me mark you off here. Okay. We had Robert that first day. Did Robert back in? Not yet. Okay.
Which Robert? Me or
the other one there? Yep.
Thank you.
I know you because you talk up, so we're good. All right. I think that's the only one we're missing today is the other Robert. Okay. So that's a little bit of trying to map those kind of attacks to the CIA part. So again, when you guys are introducing this as basic concepts, it would be really wise to take them through the CIA triad, explain that, but at this point, really explain where those attacks are coming in, which one does that affect the most. And I think we had some exercises in that first day that really helped, but being able to show them that, hey, we're going to do X, Y, Z. Where does this map to that CIA triad? And again, if they can talk to that triad, that makes them so much more employable to vendors out there, because you actually understand what's happening under the hood, or more importantly, you get how it affects the business. And if you can really train those students that, yes, this is going to be a problem because they stole credentials. But I can tell you that as CEOs, presidents, and things like that, they could care less that they got something. They want to know how it's going to impact the business. How much money are they going to lose? What products are they going to lose? That's all they're doing, because they're in the process of damage control at that point. You're trying to figure out all these details. They got a bunch of investors to talk to, or a board to talk to. So they're really more interested in how it's going to impact business. That was probably the biggest thing I learned in my career, was going from the technical side of the house to the business side, was really starting to look at it in a different perspective, as I was always laser focused in the technical. But I really needed to figure out how to talk to the business guys and let them know what was going on for the things that they cared about. That turned out to be better in the end for not just that, but then when it came time to ask for money, like when we talked about Section 179 and such, it's very hard for them to say no, because they know that I've done the research in that. It's kind of an ongoing joke with some of the old companies. They call me up this time of year, even if I'm not employed there, and say, "You sure you don't want any equipment?" Because I was always the guy asking for the expensive equipment, no matter what it was. Yeah, you got it. CEOs hate hearing that they will be ultimately accountable. You got it. Because at the end of the day, it's the truth, and a good CEO will fall on the sword. That's the the difference between some of them are out there that are just there for the cash and the ones that truly believe in whatever company they're working at. The good ones will definitely fall on the sword. Yeah. So from the defender side, we need to know what that chain is or that process that those attackers are doing, meaning that if we see a bunch of random enumeration going on, right, or identifying. So identifying would be something like doing a what system are these going to be on? What kind of OSINT data can we pull about this? In other words, what's the name of the company? How many employees? Can we figure out the names and positions of some of these people and just gather regular information off the website, or maybe through email addresses, communication, whatever it may be, in order to get an idea of the end result of who we're going after. And then we start enumerating. This will be things like your ping scans or your Nmap scans, stuff like that, to where we're trying to gather data about the network or the particular company. And that's really where knowing that the next step is going to be them actually attacking. So if we start seeing a bunch of random pings come in or somebody scanning ports on our firewalls, as a blue team, we need to know, hey, the moment they find a weakness, that's where they're going to start breaking in. So we have to start monitoring that traffic, maybe even running scans against our own infrastructure to see if maybe there's a new vulnerability that just hit and we didn't realize we were vulnerable to it. We can end up breaking that chain and detecting that issue coming in sooner. And the better and the faster we can do that, we're going to reduce that impact on our business. Everything is about patterns, not necessarily the tools, right? So we're looking for patterns of activity coming in. That's like I talked about with the Global Protect and the firewalls. That was the first thing we noticed is we were seeing that our internet was a little sluggish and we couldn't figure out why. And the first thing is always to go to the logs and see what's going on. Our normal traffic logs didn't really have a whole lot of indicators there. But when we found the individual logs for services, in this case, something like Global Protect, we could see that it was just filled with random requests. And it wasn't a flood of it necessarily, but it was enough that they were getting mighty close to what you would expect for our LDAP names that were coming in. And in that case, we were using a third-party service like Google in order to do that. So there was no local LDAP that they could break into. But you could see that they very clearly scraped the website and then came up with all the different combinations of the employees, or they gained employees' names through OSINT, and they had very carefully crafted some of the usernames that came in. And it turned out some of them were pretty close. They just didn't get passwords back. So it's a real eye opener as to all the tools and techniques they'll go through today to try to break in. All right, so on the activity side, there again, this is just some prompts for you guys to give out to students to see if you can keep them engaged in going through that attack. So what I'll do there, we're going to go into some of these other ones here in a little bit, but on this recon part, I'm guessing most of you haven't necessarily done a recon style of attack. As if you're a pen tester, right? So what goes into a recon? So what I'd like to do is if you guys came out here to the NetLab environment, and if you go to schedule lab, schedule one for the Ethical Hacking V2 Series 1. And what you would want to do is reconnaissance with Nmap, Zenmap, and Masscan. Those are three main tools that attackers will use. And this one will kind of give you some good information as to what you might see there. So if you want to make a reservation for lab 3, again, you can make it for a long reservation, even if these only take about 30 minutes, 40 minutes to kind of get through. If that, you don't have to necessarily go through the whole thing that way. But I would like you guys to kind of walk through one if you haven't done this kind of stuff, because it really gives you the information for it. Yeah, no problem, Jack. It is out there on that main website. Let me see if I could... So again, on this website, if you go out to labs and then NetLab access, it should be listed there, but I will go ahead and put it in the chat here. There you go. And again, this time when you come in and make a reservation, you'll see something like this, and you'll just need to pick this series 1, and then we want you to do lab 3 out of series 1. And just grab any of these first available pods here. I'm just going to grab one in the back so I don't trip over anybody. Remember, the username is your email address. And then your password, if you haven't logged in before, is this one here, WWC2025 with an exclamation point. If you have already logged in, you changed it to something for yourself. So once you're in that lab environment, the only thing that'll be a little different than what you've done with that is you click on this content tab, and it's best if you go ahead and undock this. This will give you a PDF of all the steps you're going to do in order to complete that lab. And so if you undock it, if you happen to have dual monitors, you can move it off to another monitor. Or if you don't, you can always use a split screen between this and this side here. And that would allow you to be able to go to the different virtual machines as it walks you through that setup. So it'll have some great information, kind of give you this topology you're going to have access to. All the usernames and passwords will be in that lab. And then it's going to give you step-by-step on how to utilize these tools. So even if you've never touched Kali Linux, you've never touched Nmap, Zenmap, all those other ones, this is going to walk you through step-by-step on how to play with those and give you some information. I would imagine Kirk and Fernando have done these. Has anybody else played with these kind of tools before? Okay, great. Yeah, so if you haven't played with this is kind of the first steps. Oh, and Lewis, I'm sorry. I was trying to think of the people that are teaching those kind of concepts, and I had a good list of that yesterday. So if you haven't done any of this, this is a really good way for you to kind of understand the very first things that attackers will do. Usually this isn't step 1, so to speak, but most people skip the OSINT step and go straight to pinging the network. That we preach that really isn't what you should do. You should go gather information based off what you can find. Then you start doing the enumeration to figure out what ports are available, that kind of stuff. So I'm going to let everybody complete this. We'll come back here about, let's go till 10:30. We'll talk about it for a little bit, and then we can take a break, and then we can come back in. Lab 3 is the one that you want to go after. Should be called reconnaissance with Nmap, Zenmap, and mass scan. Now, this particular lab is mapped out to all these different certifications. So these were labs that I had actually written back in 2020 for NDG. And we were trying to map out to pen test and EC Council CEH. Some of those, obviously, those are a little older tests now since it was 6 years ago, 5 years ago. But they're still relevant as to what's out there today. All right, I'm going to let this timer go. I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording here. All right, hopefully everybody got a chance to kind of go through that lab and take a look at what NDG offers there on that particular lab set. For those of you that haven't played with Nmap, Zenmap, did that kind of give you a good look and feel for what it's like to do reconnaissance as one of those first steps as an attacker?
I thought it was great.
Perfect. Kirk, is these labs ones that you guys use at your institution, or not yet because you just got it set up? He may still be out on break. Oh, that's right. He was on it. Yep. Forgot about that. Gotcha. No problem. So I know a couple of you were looking to set those kind of things up. But like I said, if you want to learn a little bit more in those or do some of those tools, great. Awesome. You're more than welcome to sign up with those instructor trial requests and get access to all those labs. I'm going to let you guys continue to have access to them here till probably middle of January, February, whenever I get around to doing cleanup before the next semester starts.
Hey, Jason,
Yeah.
one thing, and I see this like in a lot of these labs, you'll go through and do it, but is there anything that gives a really good explanation of what you're seeing after you've run the lab?
As far as the output that's there,
Yes.
um,
So,
so
you can see a bunch of ports and everything, but is there anything that kind of shows like next steps or what these ports are, signifying that we could give to a student and say, okay, so you found this, and now this is the next thing.
yeah, so a lot of these labs, again, were written in the way we kind of did things 5 years ago, so to speak, which is with the PDF documents. Now that we have those baked in as HTML in some of the newer labs, it does give you more explanation. So this one is more just pure labs where you're doing steps. A lot of the new lab sets, for example, Proxmox, will actually give you the equivalent of a textbook explanation of what's all going on, and then you go complete the lab. Um, these were a little bit different setup back then. These don't, but I'm happy to kind of scroll through here and kind of give a little bit of an explanation as to what you were doing here. So Nmap itself is kind of what we use as just a basic port scanner. Zenmap is just a GUI portion to that. The initial scan that you run here, this one here, basically does the standard ports that you would normally have access to, and you can see all those there. What this is showing is that something on those ports are listening. Now, typically it would be these services. In other words, these are the common ports that you would have open. So 22 being SSH, 80 being HTTP. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the service that's running there. It just, that's usually the service that would be running on that port number. A lot of times in bigger scans, you want to do TCP connections, UDP connections, and scan differently. So for example, that next one you did was to look specifically for TCP ports. You'll notice there's not a lot of difference there because in this case, there may not have been UDP ports running. The -F is going to do this in a way that's going to test the firewall. And so it's going to limit the scan to only the popular ports so that it doesn't see on the firewall side that you are jumping up to port, say 60,000, something like that. However, there are times you may want to do that. The -A, what you would have seen there is that it went ahead and not only saw the service of SSH, but it went ahead and tried to grab the banner that comes back if you were to SSH to that system. So it's executing scripts in the background, and Nginx has its own scripting language in order to capture those banners at these different places. And so in this case, it grabbed the OpenSSH banner, which tells us particularly what version number of SSH we are running. And then approximately we'll try to determine what operating system it's running on with some other commands down below. The benefit of this detailed information of grabbing this is then we can start to look for vulnerabilities that are, available on OpenSSH 5.31, and be able to get more detail. Same way with all these other services that provide some headers coming back. And then the C is actually going to test for some vulnerabilities. Usually you would do this as a first scan, and then you're going to do some kind of vulnerability scan, which is actually the next lab that you go through. But this one is really just to give us an idea of what targets we may have out there. You'll notice the same things that you did in Zenmap, but what's handy is being able to save those scans out and being able to see multiple hosts. So as you do different scans, a lot of times, like I said, they may not all respond to pings. So not seeing something respond to a ping doesn't necessarily mean nothing's there. And that Windows by default usually does not allow pings to come into a box there. So it gives you some good info, but yes, you're right. There's no detailed information as to what is this tool and all the extra info. Frankly, what a lot of that is, and what you'll see here, is we try to force you to go to the man page. And that is the best practice. If you are training students in Linux, they should be able to go to the documentation, because when they get out past the class, they got to be able to look this stuff up. And so we really try to force them to the documentation that's built in on that particular tool.
Okay. Because, yeah, I know like, and a lot of students will do the labs and kind of like I did it when I went through it just then. Yep, open mass scan, man mass scan, look, okay, close it and move on. So I guess part of it is as students go through it, really reinforce the fact that they need to be reading those man pages.
Yeah, and so what you'll tend to see in like some of the newer sets is we'll go in and we'll pull things that you would only know by going into the man page and ask questions along with it. That's typically what I've done in my older classes is rip some things out of these different labs and then build a little mini quiz in the LMS, and they have to complete the lab but also take the mini quiz. And because that mini quiz is in such a way that, these days they couldn't use AI to do that because it's only pertinent to the lab. For example, like the IP address schemes that was being used or the host that came back, you would only know that if you completed the lab or got an answer from a friend kind of thing.
All right, thanks.
Mm-hmm. So let's see here. We got about 50 minutes till lunchtime. I want to see where I was at on the schedule here. So we got through that recon side of things. The next thing, like I said, we would be doing is looking for vulnerabilities. So we noticed all these different services that are up and running. We need to figure out if there's any vulnerabilities with those particular versions of what we're running. And so a vulnerability itself is just a weakness that can be exploited, but not all vulnerabilities are going to lead to incidents. And I kind of talked a little bit about that yesterday in that we could have a really old system that's extremely vulnerable, but because we put 4 or 5 layers of security above it, meaning, different networks, different firewall rules, etc., just because it's vulnerable doesn't mean somebody can attack it, because they would have to break through several layers to get there. That kind of brings us into CVEs. And so if you haven't heard the term of CVEs before, those are common vulnerabilities and exposures. You can do an easy Google search for that kind of term. And there's several databases out there. You have the CVE one here that you can go out and do a lookup on particular CVE IDs up here, and it will give you back what are the latest and greatest ones out there. There's other good databases that will give you known CVEs over time. What's really slick, and I tend to have my students do this in the advanced Python course, they'll go tie into the APIs of those different databases for CVEs, and they have to build their own little website that pulls those in and keeps track of the stuff that they're interested in. There's the main CVE, there's a national database that you can pull that kind of vulnerability from as well. I believe it's the National Vulnerability Database. There you go. So you have MVD from the NIST website, and that allows you to get access to your CVSS and all your CVE scores that are down here below. And they have a API that you can connect to and pull that data out. It's really nice. You also want to look at publicly documented issues. So this will be stuff like release notes that they have published and say, hey, we have this problem here. And the severity doesn't necessarily equal risk as well. So if you look at some of those, you're going to see different severity levels. Have that up here, go back. So over here, you can see that these are medium levels and even a high level here, where this particular church CRM is an open church management system, and it has a SQL injection vulnerability at this particular location. If you actually read more about those, they typically tell you how they can be exploited, in what ways they can be exploited. And so you can come in here and read that. And they do that in a means of trying to get you to patch that. However, if you don't patch it, you pretty much told people how to go about doing it. So the idea is to take a look at the risk and then determine, again, the same way we did yesterday with our incident response, is what is the likelihood of somebody attacking us on this particular vulnerability? If they did, what real impact would we have? What would be our exposure? What kind of loss of data, that kind of thing would we have out there? Is our exposure on the inside or outside? So for example, if this is never an internet facing machine and it's only on the internal network, we have less exposure than we would as if it was publicly accessible. We don't necessarily have no exposure, because if somebody were to get in from the outside and be able to pivot and still access that system, then at that point we have a little bit of exposure there. But for example, I've had the IT department come back and say, hey, we found scans that say of this particular thing. I'm like, well, that's because you were trying to scan my lab environment and that has zero exposure. You guys jumped the bridge in order to do that. In other words, you plugged in our classroom and it doesn't go anywhere. So yeah, you're going to see vulnerabilities. Doesn't really mean anything because it's on a sandbox network. And that risk is still going to depend on the environment too, right? So there's still a little bit of risk. I don't know about you guys at your institutions, but where our institution still does public IPs, meaning that if my students plug into a jack here, they're going to get a public IP. Within our department, it's that way, or if they're in one of our 2-3 classrooms kind of thing, they're going to run into that where they get public IPs. It's handy in that they have their own IP at that point, and it's a public IP, so we could have them host some services, or we could show them different things in that. But the problem is if they light up a virtual machine, right? So I light up an Ubuntu virtual machine from scratch, and I just put the username in there as sysadmin and the password as password because it's just for the purposes of demonstrating in the classroom. The classroom itself is on a private IP range, but if you have wanted the ability to go out to the internet, you get a public. Within 2 to 3 minutes of putting up a new virtual machine with a standard password like that, it can be cannibalized by somebody overseas and it becomes a bot. And I've had that happen in the class. I literally just got it installed. It got a public IP. We were doing apt-get update, and by the time apt-get update and upgrade finished, it was already turned into a bot because people are constantly scanning these public networks and know that these public IPs are out there, and then they start trying to break into them right off the bat. So you got to be a little careful. Depends on what you have at your IT and your network and how that's all set up. You want to limit your environment there to make sure you are being risky right in your own lab environment. So most of those configuration issues, like we talked about yesterday, is a lot of misconfiguration or giving excessive permissions or everything set to defaults. And those defaults are probably the common issue that most people have, where they never went in and changed configuration. So it's not really a misconfiguration. They're just using default configurations. And so we're pretty adamant about showing, these are the main config files you need to go change on an Ubuntu machine or on something else. And it kind of comes back to that OS hardening that you want to make sure you're enabling the firewall on the virtual machine and not relying on the network firewall to protect you. In terms of patching takes time, right? So that could be, it takes the time to execute, but it also usually relates to downtime. And that's one thing. A lot of businesses will try to pool all those patches together, and so that they can limit the amount of downtime that they have, therefore affecting the availability leg of the CIA triad. And not only does patching take time, it goes wrong, right? I think at some point we've all had a bad Windows update. And so trying to recover from those, what does that mean for our availability for the end customer or the end user? And being able to set priorities on doing those patches. I mentioned yesterday, if you're not familiar with Tuesday is always Patch Tuesday. And so if you ever come in on Wednesday morning and your computer's not working right, just know Microsoft released patches. I laugh because I had my system left open last night to upload that YouTube video, went to bed, forgot all about closing it down. And of course, the Windows update from Tuesday forced it to reboot and I lost some of the things that I had open. So that's another one to be aware of, is just because you didn't tell it to go ahead and do the update. A lot of these, especially if they're vulnerability type updates, they're going to force themselves to reboot and an off time if you don't go change those default settings. All right. So that's when we start looking at vulnerability basics. Now you can use different scanners to look for that. So if you were to look in that lab set, we won't necessarily go through that one, but I'll show you in the lab set. You would be able to use items like OpenBoss is one. Nessus is a pretty common one now, which is out there from Greenbone, and a couple other ones. Those are vulnerability scanners. And so they know, based off the known packages you have, for example, that OpenSSH server, it will go look for all the vulnerabilities of 5.31, and then it will report those back to you as potential issues that you could potentially exploit. So it doesn't actually exploit them. All it does is take a list of running services and try to figure out whether or not you could be vulnerable in that state. We can also do that through network analysis. You'll notice this lab here is evading an intrusion detection system. So we talked about intrusion detection systems yesterday. That's where once you're on the network, right? So intrusion prevention is helping you catch it before it ever gets on the network. Intrusion detection, they've already made their way in. We're trying to detect that they got in. And there's ways to evade that. So whether you pivot or you're very slow, so like in those in-map scans that you did there, you can actually set a timer so that it's only pinging one of those every few minutes to see if it's up. That's the thing about attackers is when they break in, it is never a 5-minute, 10-minute show. They get what they want and get out. It is a month to 2-month, 3-month long process, sometimes up to a year of them infiltrating the network before they fully take out the data that they're really interested in. It's a very slow, methodical process. And the idea behind that is they want to evade all of that intrusion detection. They want to evade your firewall and also start maintaining as much data as they can possibly gain access to. So if they slowly work their way around the network and build in multiple rootkits so that they have things talking back to them and they don't have to re-break in case something got patched, that's kind of their forte and what they're looking to do. I believe Lewis and those were talking about Metasploit and the Metasploitable framework. It's a really good one for actually executing on those exploits and those vulnerabilities and being able to do that. So that's kind of a fun lab to get people to do. And then working your way down through these other options. Eventually, you set up that back door. This is that rootkit type thing I'm talking about, where I make your PC phone home to me. So instead of me having access to you, your PC is actually setting up a backdoor all the way out to me all the time. And the benefit of that is if you tie it to a DNS or something like we talked yesterday, then I can host servers at different locations. You're sending it to a DNS request, and I have it being load balancing and sending it to multiple PCs. So as an attacker, I can be sitting here just watching my machine, and all of a sudden a console will pop up on the screen. That means some PC is checking back in with me, and I can go ahead and start attacking that. And at a very basic level, they're doing it here with Netcat. They will even do it with VNC. There's other lab sets that will take that to the next degree, which is entire frameworks being able to automatically phone back in with you. All right. So that kind of brings us into those attack and defend exercises and looking at what an attacker's thinking, what is the defense response. I know we wanted to kind of build something like this, and it can be a little troublesome, but CTFs are really a good way of doing that with students or holding little mini capture the flags. We talked about VulnHub the other day, which is another resource I should probably list out here. So let me just do that real quick while I'm thinking about it. Let's see. And so VulnHub is just a big resource for you to be able to pull down virtual machines that have vulnerabilities on them. And there's different scenarios. And these are things that essentially people in the real world are just offering up as a way for you to train or test your skills. So it's really, really good for student organizations or a group, or you don't have the time to design your own. You just want to pull one down. It's a great resource for that. There isn't a whole lot of support, so to speak, with it. So if you don't get it working, you're kind of on your own to get it up and going. But it is a good resource. And then looking over here on the defensive observations and no real exploits, that's kind of what we do in the classroom. But the whole goal I have for you guys is to be able to build some real world scenarios and just safe environments for them to execute on. So hopefully we can get to a couple of those here today. The CTF style problem solving, the idea is that it emphasizes they have to have logic in order to do it. They have to do some pattern recognition and persistence and teamwork. There's a couple different ways to put on the CTFs, and we'll talk about that. One way is just each is to their own, but a lot of times we'll do it in team-based, and that's really good because they can communicate, and it's more realistic in the real world. Not very often are you going to have one person trying to go out and defend or attack. You're usually going to work in groups in order to pull that off. And then as far as teaching is looking at reward reasoning, basically, when I do CTFs, it's great that they can capture the flags and gain points, but I always set it up where they require a written explanation of what they did and what they could have done differently. And I tend to weigh heavily on this portion to make them understand that it's great you hacked or gained the flag, right? But if you can't document what happened or give people information, then as a job, if your job is to do a pen test, then it's very hard for you to go back to the CEO or the president and say, here's what I did, but this is how it really impacts your business. And this is how easily I was able to come in. Now, that was me because you gave me XYZ resources potentially. An outside attacker may not be able to do that so easily, but they do have the resources to be able to do it. I can say the biggest thing you can give the students, if it's even possible, is to get them into one of those competitions where they have a red team, blue team type effect, whether they're the blue team and the red team is attacking them all the time, or if they have a group of instructors on a blue team and they are the red team trying to break in and capture flags kind of thing. Both directions work really, really well, and they gain the best information. And there's a lot of free ones out there for that. So you don't necessarily have to design those. There's some Hack the Box, and there's several free competitions out there. We'll talk a little bit about that with CTFD. Yeah, Cyber Patriot is really good on the high school side. CTFD is generally the platform that a lot of these will use. And what they will do is mesh up with, I'm trying to think of the partner here, and I know it'll show up when we get it going. Just a second. And if you wanted, you could have them host a CTF for you. But typically, this is something we can run here local on our side. There's a good listing of all the CTFs out there, and I'm trying to remember. These guys integrate to it. I'm trying to remember what it is. Let's see here. Just a minute. Oh, no, I'll find it here. Major Cyber Leak. There we go. So the Major Cyber League is one that CTFD instantly integrates with, and you can see a bunch of these events that are out here. So they'll tell you what style it is, whether it's a Jeopardy style or it's a full-on attack type style. So we'll keep scrolling through here, see if we can find a full attack one. Might be like this other one, right? And so you can go out to this website. Obviously, this must be blocked or not currently up, or it's old, in this case, 2019. But this is a good contact. There's some other cybersecurity panels, and I'm trying to think of what those challenges are. Let me see if I can think of the name of that. Let's see here. CTF time. That's the one I'm looking for. See if that link is still there. So CTF time is basically a database of all the CTFs going on. A lot of people try to post theirs out here so they can get a lot of participants. And it's a great way for you to find them through as a student or a student organization and get some of your students involved. Now, some of these are going to be very big ones and you know, these got the big individuals kind of thing. But if you're looking for educational ones, you can still find some of those out here. So for example, if we look at this Hero CTF, for example, we can find out this is a Jeopardy style. And if we go out to the URL, looks like it's not currently up. It expired back in November. So let me go back and see ones that are running now. That'd be the ones up here. And another Jeopardy style one. And so this one is using that, and you could get into the CTF. Let's see if it pulls up here. There you go. They want you to download these files in order to interact with the CTF itself. And then here's the main challenges going through. So there's There's a lot of these. This is just one random example there, but there's a lot listed out there, and it's kind of a good resource for you to use as instructors to find stuff if you don't have them available. All right, with that, let me come into what I had for day 3. So that kind of brought us to this CTF portion where we could kind of build our own. And so I think we can get started with that here before lunch. And then when we get back from lunch, we'll start working on the questions and stuff for it. So CTFD was what I just introduced here. I did put that on the resources page. So if you come out to URL resources and training, you'll see CTFD out here. And this is just a group that has an open source scoring system. A scoring engine is really all it is. It's really easy to use both for students and for instructors in order to set up a CTF. There are some other ones out there, but this one's pretty easy to stand up. And you can customize it. You can buy additional plugins, or you can write your own plugins if you get into some really cool ones. Plugins that are worth buying that I personally bought, if they still have them here, you could do like the learning theme, which kind of has this collapsible window. It's just a theme that changes the look and feel of it. But really, it's this multiple choice one is the one I like. And that's especially if I'm doing Jeopardy style events, or if I'm using it as a quiz or a final exam so that they actually get points within the environment. And then those points they get, they could turn around and use for actual hints when they're out there doing the hacking. It's worth the $20 for the little plugin. They have some manual verification ones and then just different themes on that side. I have worked on building some plugins and stuff myself. I just haven't gotten back to that. That was many, many years ago when I was writing CTFs. So what we want to do is be able to deploy this. Now you'll notice on their pricing, this is if you let them host it, all right? So the only reason that you would ever want to go down this path is you don't have the resources to host one, or you're hosting it and it's where you want, thousands and hundreds of thousands of users coming to your event. You may want to let them host it so all the traffic goes to them, right? But we're obviously on the school side, so we want to make sure we host this ourselves. There are some cool features that you do if you get a bigger hosted one, like having Slack and Discord integration. But again, these are the people that are hosting really big events. So to use it on our side, what we want to do is use the GitHub portion, and they have this link down here. I also went ahead and linked that right below this is the CTFD GitHub. And we can see the CTFD page here, and we want CTFD. That's the main package that we can use. And if you scroll down over here, you can see that we can pull out and check out this repository just like you guys did with my lab set. But you'll notice that they have some Docker Compose files in here. So there's a way for you to use Docker and load this up in a Docker container. That's how I recommend doing it. That's how I do it myself. And so they will give you install instructions. And this is if you want to check the whole project out and run that Docker program directly, or use Docker Compose, which I encourage you to use that. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in the Docker setup. The other options is there's usually some pre-built CTFD packages, so you can do it as a one-liner like this one here, and it will automatically pull that image out without you having to download from the Git repository. So that's a pretty good intro into the Docker side. You guys have all seen this Docker desktop. All this is a GUI, which is a nice way for you to see all the Docker containers that are running. In my case over here, I have that labs project that we've been doing in here. You can see my web project that this is just a website, a local version of it. Notice how it's local host that I'm using for the dev side. So when I code on this side, I can make sure it looks good before I actually push it out. And then I have several different projects I'm working on in the background, but it's a great way for you to see this. Now, if you're a true Docker enthusiast and you don't want the GUI, you can do that same thing with Docker PS, and you can see what kind of virtual machines are running, or in this case, containers are running. But you'll notice the big difference up here is these all have down arrows, right? And those down arrows indicate that those were Compose files. And so the main difference between Docker and Docker Compose, you can see those two commands here, is that Docker is going to be a single container. So if you see a command on the internet and you're trying to run Docker and they just have a command like this, that is going to run one single container. If you see a Docker compose, usually what that means is that there's more than one container firing up, and that's for additional services. So if we look at this Docker compose file here, you'll notice that we are launching an instance called CTFD, which is the Docker package that is running the CTFD instance. And then it's also running Nginx, which is a web server. So by default, this is just running, and it's meant to be ran locally. It's not really meant to be ran for production unless you run it behind a full-blown web server like Nginx. And then you also typically want it to run a full database server for storing all the information. If you don't do that, it's using a local file for database. And so it will work in a classroom, but it wouldn't work if you were trying to host it for a lot of students publicly, that kind of thing. You would want to run this entire setup. And then for caching purposes, to expedite some things, they do have some Redis package here. Lots of mumbo jumbo, but the long story short is a compose you can think of as like a group of Docker containers that all work together to deliver some kind of service. So in the CTFD instance, we have the CTFD itself, Nginx, a database server, a caching server, all working together to deliver the CTFD instance out to students. If you want that as like an all-in-one, just for the purposes of learning, we could run that single Docker command and just run it locally. And that'll work great for you building out stuff for your students. And then if you go to host one, publicly so that your students can access it, you may want to step up to the Docker Compose in order for it to execute smoother. Our case, what we're going to do is just copy this line right here. And what that does is it says Docker run. So we're going to run this container. -P is going to tell us what port we want to run this on. So this is kind of doing NAT, so to speak, but not full IP address. We're just doing port mapping. And 8000:8000 means that we want to run it on our host, aka my laptop here. If we were to go to port 8000, it's going to point to 8000 inside the Docker container. So inside port, outside port. Typically, those will match up. However, if you have a lot of services running, like for example, in my Docker containers here, we can see that this one is running on 8091, and on the inside, it's running on port 5000. The reason I'm using 5000 here is this is a little Flask app. That's that website I built for this class. It's running Flask, and Flask by default runs on port 5000. I could easily change that to port 80, and then all of a sudden it's running like a normal website. Or even a 443 if I wanted to be HTTPS. Now, just because I'm running on 443 doesn't mean it's actually serving up HTTPS. I would have to have other things in place in order for that to work. By default, this is going to run in HTTP and not HTTPS. So if you want to make this secure, which I would recommend you doing if it's outside of the lab environment, you would want to run it behind like an Nginx proxy manager. And I can kind of show you the back end of what something like that would look like. This -IT just says that we're going to run it in the terminal as we're going. And then the CTFD/CTFD points to the package for CTFD in the repository or the registry that's available from Docker. So if we just copy this line, and we come in here to our Docker desktop and we open up this terminal. Again, if you haven't done that, it's this little terminal icon down here at the bottom. We can right click and paste that in and hit enter. And what it's going to say is, hey, I don't have the latest copy of that image that you asked for, CTFD. I'm going to go download it. And so this is going to pull all that information from the Docker repository. And then once it has it downloaded, it's going to go ahead and start a container specifically for that. We can see that happening on the screen. And you'll notice you usually see something like this, where I am listening for this at quad zeros on port 8000, which means it's listening on all interfaces of my laptop on port 8000. We can see that the name popped up here. It gave it a random name called Nostalgic Bell. If you don't specify that in the command line, that's what will happen. It'll just give it a random name, give you a container ID, what image is running, and what port it's running on. Notice there is no drop down because we didn't use the Docker Compose. We're just running this single container. If I click on this 8000 or I bring up a web browser to port 8000, this is that CTFD instance and you can be up and running right away. So this is really the beauty of Docker is you don't have to know Git, you don't know how to run a full-blown web server, you don't have to put a bunch of stuff together. They're usually written and distributed in a way that you can just run one single command, launch that container, and you're usually up and running. Now, if you want to do it for production, there's a whole lot of things you should do in order to secure yourself. But for the classroom, this is fantastic. So those of you that have access to Docker Desktop, you're more than welcome to go ahead and start this here in the terminal. You can do this in the NetLab environment if you chose to do so. So if you come back to NetLab and you wanted to follow along with this just so you had familiarity with it, you can make that reservation for this lab environment and go ahead and do an open lab, and then go ahead and click on that terminal icon at the bottom of Docker and run that command for CTFD. You can also go to this website inside that VM, so it's easy to copy and paste out. To stop that, you'll notice I'm seeing the log output down here. I can go ahead and hit Control-C, and you'll notice it'll end up shutting off that particular container. The reason it's running down here in the terminal is because I ran it with IT. If I take out the IT and just do CTFD, it will go ahead and start the container in the background, but you typically won't see it in the foreground up here. You could also stop it. So in this case, it's going to go ahead and run it. I could go up to one of these containers and I could hit play again, and it would go ahead and start it back up from scratch, but it isn't running in my terminal window down below. Now notice when I click on that link, it tries to plug in the quad zeros and the 8000. You can't really go to that, but you can go to localhost on 8000 and it would work just fine. The odd part about this, there again, it's listening on all interfaces. So with my particular laptop I have here, it's actually got a public IP. And so if I gave you that IP right now, you would be able to hit this from all of your web browsers for this particular instance. And so we're going to do a little bit of that here today so that we can build out questions and stuff into the activity. But does anybody have any questions or getting this up? You got it, Onesimo. So you can't have multiple containers running on the same port. So for example, we can see this guy's running on 8000. If I tried to start this other one, which is also on 8000, I'm going to get this 500 error down here. And that's because two containers are trying to use the same port. You can override this. So if I come in here and edit this in the settings, so if I click on this container and look at the inspection of when it was ran, I could go edit some files. If you wanted, for example, 2 instances of CTFD running, you could redo this command and just change this first number to 8001, hit enter, and it would go ahead and create a container on 8001. And once that's up, we can see I got that instance here, but I also have this instance over here. Again, this would work great in the classroom. You don't have to have a full VM. You don't have to have even the Compose one if you don't want to, but it's a great way to get started. But to demonstrate that Compose and what the difference is, I'm going to go ahead and shut these two down. And then if I wanted to, I could go ahead and delete them because we haven't done any data or anything like that on them. So I'm going to go ahead and delete those particular ones. All right. From the terminal down here, if we run the compose command, which is just Docker compose up, the only way that works is if you actually pull down this full repository. So you would have to pull down this entire Docker compose like this. And what this does is take all those files, build out a Docker container, and then it packages all those other ones up between it. We talked a little bit about using AI in order to help you with some of this, and I encourage you to do that. So I'm going to pull up a good example here. Give me a second. All right, so here's ChatGPT with nothing super fancy. This doesn't have the high-end upgrade. This is just the free one that's out there. And you can do a good job of saying, can you give me a Docker Compose file for running CTFD? And so this is going to be very similar to the Compose file that you saw on their GitHub. The difference in this one is it's going to use that little pre-built Docker container along with all those other services so that you don't have to check out their entire repository in order to do that. Because you're not looking to code CTFD, you just want to utilize the product, right? So to do that, we can take this file that came out of ChatGPT, which is just a little YAML file, and say we open up a notepad here. We copy and paste that in. Now we'd want to review it a little bit. We don't want to use it blindly, just to make sure that everything looks like we'd want it to. This is essentially starting that CTFD instance that we just did earlier. Still running on port 8000, which is fine for us. It does have some production level like workers and things like that. That just makes it run faster. We have a database coming in, and they're going to use Maria DB by default. Notice this has a root password that we should probably change if we're going to use it in production. So we could do something like my password. Obviously, it should be more secure than even that. And then you could change these other passwords if you want. I would not change these username and passwords here because CTFD is configured specifically for those. We have a cache server, and then it's going to create volumes. So in Docker, when you normally build a container like we did earlier, it is the data that's in that container is ephemeral, meaning that if I shut it down and wipe it, that data is gone. Or if I turn it off and turn it back on, it may contain some data depending on how it's stored. Docker has this concept of volumes, and you can think of these as like external hard drives to the Docker container. If I create a volume and then I delete the container, the data is still available. It's stored on kind of an external drive, so to speak. And then I can marry that container back up with that same volume if I wanted to update a newer version. So that's the idea behind Docker, is that the service itself we can update without losing any data because the data is on a separate volume or a separate storage location. Those volumes can live local on the system that you're running them on, like we're doing here on a laptop, or they could be running out in the Amazon cloud, and you're pointing to like S3 buckets for your volumes. You could have a big volume server, and those are all connected. So there's multiple ways to do Docker. We do want to utilize volumes because that allows us to save our data for the time being, that if we end up tearing down the main Docker container, if we were to run this back up, it would pick up from all of our data and keep running. So once we have this down into a simple text file like this one here, we need to save this someplace that we can launch from. So I'm just going to put this in my downloads folder is fine. And we want to change this from a text file all. We want to call it Docker Compose .yml or YAML. YAML, if you're not familiar with that, is just a structured type text. So you guys have heard of JSON. YAML is another type of markup text that a lot of people will use. And sometimes you'll see it as YAML like this or ML. Both are acceptable when you go to execute it here. All right. Since we're not making any changes, we're going to go ahead and just save that. And then if I go to my Docker container here and I go into my downloads folder, now I wouldn't recommend using this in downloads, but it's an okay location for what we're doing. We can now go ahead and go back to ChatGPT, and it tells you how to launch that. So we're going to copy this compose file or this command. If you guys notice, this is very similar to what we did with my lab environment, right? So if you go look at my code on GitHub, there is a Docker compose that then organizes all the different containers inside of it, and it's going to fire them all up at once. Or we will fire up the ones we want. In our case, you notice I had the hub command after that, and that's because we just wanted to fire up the container called hub. In this case, we want to run the full thing, so we do Docker create. And if we go back to our containers, you'll notice this time we see one called downloads, but it has this down arrow, and that is because we fired up 3 individual containers. One is CTFD itself. We have a Redis one and a database one. Now you'll notice while this one created, it's still spinning, right? And so it's not fully up yet. If we were to click on it and look at the logs, we can see that there's some errors. And in this case, I didn't define a secret key. We need to do that in order to run this for a production file. So I either need to create a secret key file or I need to set an environment variable. With Docker, there's a lot of different environment variables that you may need to set. In our case, we can tweak the Docker Compose here so that in this CTFD instance, we can just set a secret key in here for now. Normally, you wouldn't want to do this in your Docker Compose. You might want to do it in a separate file. But if you own it on your own system, it's not a big deal. If you're using GitHub, like what I'm doing, I obviously don't want to put my secret key in a file that I'm uploading to GitHub. That would be bad, right? Because then everybody can see what my secret key is. In this case, it doesn't matter because we're just doing this as a demo. So we'll save that as my secret key. If I come back here and do a Docker Compose stop, and then we run the same up command, you should see that Docker container built. Notice it went green right away. If we click on it, it found that secret key that we created. It's setting up the database in the back end, and it's also listening on port 8000 again. So if I come out here and click on that, notice it looks exactly the same. The only difference is now it's being backed by a really good database. It has caching in place so that if a bunch of students were hitting this all at once, it's going to perform faster. But there again, inside the classroom, you can easily just use the Docker command and have one simple container. Now, I know that was a really big crash course in Docker and CTFD at once. Was anybody able to follow along or be able to run that one command on their laptop? Like I said, for now, I would just run this one command here, and that will get you a CTFD instance up and running on your laptop. Okay, great, Jack. Appreciate that.
I can say I was simply paying attention and trying to keep up. You started going so fast. I was absolutely just watching what you were doing as opposed to watching and trying it, watching it. I couldn't keep up. So I was just paying attention.
Yeah, that's no problem. I apologize for that. I tend to, this is the part where I start playing with tools, and so I go a little fast. So by all means, feel free to slow me down, especially if you are trying to follow along. I'm happy to do that. That one in particular, I was trying to explain the difference between a regular run and a Docker Compose. Because if you're out there looking on the internet for, say, some of these other things that I pointed you out to, a lot of these are going to have Docker containers. And so they'll give you the instructions on how to deploy it. Most of them are going to be in a Docker Compose type format, in which case you need to download the Docker Compose file and then execute that. ChatGPT is really good at trying to, if you need to get one up on the fly, it will essentially just take what's out there on the net and put a couple of those together, which is essentially what this Docker Compose here did. So the difference between me running this one and the one that's available from their website or their GitHub is that with their GitHub, I would have to have checked out all of the code from them. And like this, I would have to check out all this code. So whether I did that with Git or I come up here and do a download zip and extract it and then run that Docker command inside of there. This way is just a little bit cleaner. It's already prepackaged at their release version. So you'll notice they have release numbers over here on the right. And so that one's set up at version 381. That's what I immediately pulled down on my site. Again, if you're not looking to tweak or write code for CTFD to change the underlying product, you're just wanting to utilize it, your best bet is either running this Docker command here or having it create a custom compose. Great question, Hector. So are the challenges built in or do we have to specify them when we ask ChatGPT? You will have to do that at another point. And that's what we're going to do here when we come back from lunch, is how to actually build the challenges and all that stuff in. So for now, we just have a service up and running. You'll notice that it's a setup page, and we're going to walk through that setup when we get back from lunch here. I was trying to get us to a good break point, which is hopefully you have this screen here at some point. Whether you want to do this locally or you want to do it on the NetLab instance, either way works. Because I would like for you guys to build out some of your own challenges. And then if you wanted, we could kind of all do one together and then export that. And I'll talk about that, where once you build this out, you can export all that data, all your challenges and everything else to a zip file. And then if you build out a new CTF later, you can just dump in that zip file. So what I tend to do is I have one CTF instance that's running all the time for my students. For example, this cybersecurity one. I come in as the admin and I dump in a different zip file, which completely changes the CTF for something else. So in this class, I had CTF 1 that was introduced about halfway through the semester. CTF 2 was about 2 or 3 weeks later. And then they got their final exam that they had to do within the last 2 or 3 weeks of class. So it was a great way to use one instance that's out there running live on the internet, and I just could change out those different challenges on the fly. But the real question, and that's what Hector's asking, is do we have to write the challenges, or can we use some AI to help us with that? And we can definitely do that. So I will show you how to do that so that you're not having to come up with all these random questions.
So Jason, I was following along. I did the Chat GPT, got my Docker Compose and everything. And it is saved in my downloads folder. So now how do I get to it to run it?
Yep, you can come into the terminal here on your Docker desktop. Make sure you go into your downloads folder. So it may be a CD downloads. And then from there, you can run your Docker Compose up. Again, you wouldn't necessarily have to use a Docker Compose version of it when you're just playing and learning CTFD, because what it is a really robust instance of CTFD, and where you guys are just building challenges and stuff out right now. I personally build it out with that single Docker command, and then I save my zip file, and then I upload it to a place where I've done this full-blown Docker instance. So I have a hosting service on DigitalOcean or Amazon or wherever I'm hosting the live CTF. I only need to have one copy of it, so it costs me $5 a month or whatever it is for the smallest instance. And there I install Docker and run that Docker command. Now the good news is you can take like the free tier or a very small instance at those different online cloud providers. If you wanted it to be public accessible, you could run it on your own system, pass it through as a port forward, whatever you want. Or if you just wanted to use the cloud for that purpose, whether it was Amazon, DigitalOcean, etc., you could use their cheap tier, which is like $5 a month. We could set up Docker on there, and then you can run all sorts of Docker containers on there, hosting services out for students or yourself or whatever you wanted. So if you don't want to deal with that, then you can actually buy it from CTF themselves. Now, I again wouldn't recommend that. $60 a month is a little steep for this service. The thing is you do get support from them. You do get lots of extra features that you don't get in the free version, so to speak. So as a school, it may make sense for you to run it for a couple months if you're going to do a big challenge. Again, on these, you'll notice that this is not secured, so we're just using HTTP. If you want to get to an HTTPS setup, that's a little bit different. We would have to run another container, which is, if you look back here at this CTF instance that ChatGPT created, said, hey, would you really like us to have TLS and HTTPS? Now it's recommending using traffic. I wouldn't use traffic. That's a little more complicated. I would use Nginx proxy, and that's a lot easier for you to pull off. As a matter of fact, you could build it out in this little compose file, and it would do that. So if you could say, please use Nginx proxy manager to deliver it via HTTPS. And so what that will do is just tweak our Docker Compose file so that we're also having an instance of Proxy Manager. Now you'll notice it wants you to create a directory structure here, and that we want to include that with those different config files. And now we see Proxy Manager inside there. So what it does is it listens on port 80 and 443. And then behind the scenes, we can run CTFD in it. We might be able to run our Saracata in there or a bunch of these other containers we're looking at. And the beauty of that is these are all going to be SSL encrypted. So when you come out here to my CTF, for instance, this is running behind an Nginx proxy manager. I run all my websites. So the website you guys are using to access this class, all of that is basically a Docker instance that's in the cloud with proxy manager in front of it. And that way I can serve it up in a secure fashion. Little over what we can do in this class, but just trying to give you a high level that you can look at. Great. So this is a good stopping point here, meaning that we probably have our instance up, or you could do that over lunch here, is be able to go back and just run that one command. That's all you want to run to get us to that point. Pull it up here. You just want to run this one command on the screen. That's it. And if it works, you should be able to get a screen that looks something like this over here on the right-hand side. So I'm going to put these side by side so that you run this command, and you should be able to get this running on port 8000 locally. All right, let's take our lunch break. When we immediately come back from lunch, I want to make sure I get everybody checked in. And before we start into the CTF project, let's go ahead and take the post assessment. So we'll talk about the questions on there, what's all there, and then I'll have you guys take that. So that'll probably take us up to, I don't know, you should be able to get it done in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, if that kind of thing. Again, it's going to be open book, open notes. So you're welcome to be, the goal is that you actually do use the resources on the website, because then you can know where to go back and look, and that way you can look it up later. That was actually my intention behind that. So if you don't know the answer, come back in here and look at which one gave you the actual answer for that. Once we're done with the post assessment and I got everybody checked in, got you a grade, then we can jump right back into building out this CTF. And then we can get to the, the other concepts that we had for the rest of the day. So I'll cover a little bit.
Where will the assessment be? Will it be in our?
It will be out here on this main website that we've been getting all this documentation from. Okay. I built it in down here at the bottom. So you'll see assessment and then post assessment.
Cool.
But I'll be happy to walk everybody through that when we get back from lunch. That way I can get everybody graded. All right. I will see you back here in about an hour.
Can you put that back up on the screen of the instructions to?
Yes.
And where are we getting into that from? I'm under the day 3 overview, but where did you?
You're talking about this one here?
Yeah, that's where I'm at.
So if you come down to resources and URLs, and then if you scroll down towards the bottom here, you'll see the CTFD GitHub link. And I can also put that in the chat here. That's no problem. And once you get there, just kind of scroll down until you see this Docker command. I don't have a problem putting that in the chat there as well. And then, like I said, to run that, you just pull that up in Docker, open up your terminal down here at the bottom, and you just run it right there on the command line.
Now, one of the questions I have for this Docker is, where did you set that up? Did you do that on the first day? Because I don't remember seeing.
Yeah, we went through that on the first day. So to get access for Docker, if you come down here and click on this Docker desktop link, which is off the website as well, under resources, You can click on download Docker Desktop, and then if you're running Windows or whatever, you can follow those instructions there.
Okay, I did so and I close and restart. Is that necessary in Windows 11 or not?
More than likely, it'll cause you to reboot. Yeah, because it has to talk to the subsystem in the kernel of Windows. So once you reboot, you should be able to launch Docker Desktop. You can just go through the start menu and type in Docker Desktop, and you get this screen here.
Okay, I will give that a shot then.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem.